Hey there, macro folks. This is Mr. Hooker, and today we are looking at Chapter 15 Monetary Policy, GDP, and the Price Level. This will be the final chapter of macro. It should be about 2 videos. So let's get into the action. So we have 4 tools of monetary policy, and they are the open market operations, the administered rates, forward guidance, and the federal funds rate. So let's look at each one of these. So open market operations, which is used much less now post 2008 than it was pre 2008. They were looking how to get away from this um, up till 2008, and then all of a sudden the Great Recession happened. And next thing you know, they were like, "Yeah, this looks like a good opportunity," and they got away from it. So it's used to influence the money supply. It's the buying and selling of government securities to decrease or increase interest rates. This happens at the open market desk in New York. And so here is a little bit of how this goes. And so if the Fed is buying bonds, basically think of the bond sellers as individuals or banks. It works better if they are banks or institutions. But so if they're banks and they have reserves, and they don't have as much in excess reserve, they sell bonds to the Fed. The Fed gives them money. That money becomes immediate excess reserves, which means it's immediate loanable funds. And now they have money to make loans with. They will basically lower the interest rate, and boom, you now have money, right? And there's money out there to be loaned, and that is good for the economy. If they are selling bonds, right? The bond buyer has money, which is excess reserve at that point. The Fed is selling bonds to them. Bonds are guaranteed money. So apparently they have excess reserves that are not making money. They've tried to make loans. People don't want their money, whatever it is. The Fed offers bonds which are going to pay interest at least semi-annually, possibly quarterly, depending on the type of bond. And the institutions will be like, yeah, I'll take that. And so they take the bonds, they give up the excess reserves, and the next thing you know, they have lost the ability to make loans, which now raises the interest rate. But they're holding bonds that are going to pay interest. So for the institution, it's not a bad thing. They've got interest paying securities, but the interest rate will go up because the excess reserve level in the economy has gone down. So if the Fed buys bonds, the money supply increases because the Fed has created new money to pay for the bonds. The Fed buying increases bond demand, driving up the equilibrium bond price. And on interest rates, the bond interest rate decreases, the equilibrium bond price increases. And the Fed sells bonds, the money supply decreases because the Fed removed from circulation the money that it receives from the bonds. And Fed selling increases bond supply, driving down the equilibrium bond price. And bond interest rate increases as equilibrium bond price decreases. So administered rates. So this is the newest tool since 08. This is the most used thing we do now. So here we go. Interest rate on reserve balances. So money kept at the Fed. The Fed now pays interest on that. The more money you keep at the Fed will pay interest on it. So the Fed can now raise or lower that interest rate to have you, have you keep more money at the Fed. Overnight reserve repo rate. So note that says overnight reserve repo rate. So the thing that Silicon Valley Bank got in trouble with was they were doing 3-month repos. And it's like kids and candy. If a little is good, a lot must be better, right? So if you can get a little bit of interest on an overnight repo, how much interest can you get on a 3-month repo? And they were figuring, hey, we'll never need the money. We won't need the money for 3 months. Who cares? And then inflation happened, and they needed the money, and they couldn't get the money, and they went broke. And that's the problem. That was the problem. So overnight is what the Fed backs. Okay. So the Fed does overnight repos, reverse repos, and repos. So basically, what this is loans and reverse loans, depending on what you're doing. And there's arbitrage involved in this. Depending on what the Fed is paying and what the federal funds rate is, there's a lot of arbitrage involved in this. So basically, what happens is the Fed will either borrow securities from the bank or sell securities to the bank, depending on whether it's a repo or a reverse repo, and pay interest or receive interest. Okay. And it depends on how this goes. So it depends on what the reserve repo rate is, and then what the federal funds rate is, how banks are playing this. So, and this is where the arbitrage comes in, because if the repo rate is higher, what you're going to do is you're going to borrow money from the Fed, or you're going to, well, if the repo rate is higher, you're actually going to borrow money on the reserve rate. You're going to borrow money at not the reserve rate, the federal funds rate, and then you are going to loan money, do the reverse repo on the federal funds, on the overnight reserve repo. So you're going to borrow money on the federal funds market and then do a reverse repo on the overnight reverse repo rate. So it's just really kind of weird. You're trying to play the spread on these overnight games. It's really just a weird thing to do. But if you're talking, you're talking like, you're talking hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars for one night at like 0.2%. And that adds up over time. And so they get money, they make money on these things. So that's basically how that's actually going. And so that will influence the money market, and that's what banks are doing with all this money. And so if you can do millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, and make 0.2% on it, that's tens of thousands of dollars. So that's free money basically. And that's going to pay somebody's salary for a month. There you go. So discount rate is basically the rate that the Fed charges member banks to borrow money from the Fed. That is the last place anybody wants to go for money, Bo. And so the Fed has full credibility to enforce these administered rates. So the discount rate is the rate at which financial institutions can borrow money from the Fed. It's basically only used during major financial crises. The Fed can create any amount of money that is needed during these times, just because it is that lender of last resort. As I say, people don't want to do this because basically the Fed rate, that discount rate is going to be the highest rate out there. The three administered rate, January 2020 and 22, discount rate, interest paid to the Fed for currency reserves borrowed against collateral. In January 2020, it was 2.25. January 22, it was 0.25. Interest on reserve balances, January 2020, it was 1.55. January 22, it was 0.15. Overnight repo rate, January 2020, it was 1.45. And January 22, it was 0.05. So literally, they're probably borrowing on the overnight repo rate and then loaning at the federal funds rate if they can. All right. So forward guidance is communicating to the public how the Federal Reserve sees the state of the economy and intends to conduct monetary policy going forward. This will influence the stock market and the bond market. And so individuals and businesses use the information to shape financial decisions. and can affect the economy's money supply. So that is how that actually ends up working out for us. The federal funds rate, the Federal Reserve's policy rate, that's the target rate that they actually go for. That helps to communicate the monetary policy stance. It's determined in the federal funds market. The Fed actually has no control over it as an institution. They just target it with other policies. Now, this is the rate used between banks. So, if one bank and another bank, let's say Region and Horizon, um, get together, let's say Region needs money at the end of the night, they would call Horizon and say, look, we need to borrow $10,000. And so the reason that you would do this is the Fed or the FDIC, if they are going to check your bank, will check it at 7 a.m. And so at the end of the day, you count your money, you find out how you are, and if you have enough money in your bank. And if you do, if you don't, then you call another bank close to you, and you call them and get the money from them. You borrow from them on the um, federal funds rate, and then you just get them to fax a letter over saying, "Hey, we loaned them X amount of money," and you put it in your vault, and that counts because they're going to come in at 7 a.m. All right. So the Fed sets a federal funds target range. The effective federal funds rate, equilibrium interest rate, um, is in the federal funds market. So evolution of this, prior to the recession 07-08, the Fed used a smaller number of monetary policy tools, open market operations. But the Fed appeared to be out of options as the effective funds rate fell to zero and the zero lower bounds problem. So they used quantitative easing, which was trying to lower longer term interest rates through open market bond purchases, and quantitative tightening, which was selling bonds to raise interest rates. These did not work well, did not go as well as they wanted. So the pros of this, it appeared to be effective. They learned to influence long-term interest rates. The cons, Congress is encouraged to run larger budget deficits, and there was the danger of inflation. So the deficits ballooned with all of this. Here's an econ movie on the Fed and monetary policy from Despicable Me. I'll have this in the class for you. The dual mandate, Congress ordered the Fed to pursue two objectives: full employment rate of unemployment and the target rate of inflation. This came out of the early 1970s with stagflation, and Nixon was getting blamed for the unemployment. And so basically, he said, "It's not my fault. It's the Fed's fault. The Fed that's the Fed's job. It's not my job." So I actually feel bad for the Fed for this, because this is all pretty much Nixon's kind of on that. The full employment rate of unemployment, there's a target rate of unemployment, which is the Fed's current estimate of the full employment rate, which is 4 to 6%. So we go with 4%. And so expansionary monetary policy, just like expansionary fiscal policy, is needed if the actual unemployment rate rises. Restrictive monetary policy, needed if the actual unemployment rate falls. Neutral monetary policy, needed if actual unemployment rate is near 3.5%. The target rate of inflation was set at 2% per year since 2012. It compensates for upward measurement bias and protects savers. It helps with downward wage flexibility as well, and avoids the zero lower bound problem by setting inflationary expectations. Oops, too far. There we go. Oh my gosh. All right, there we go. So there is your, so now it's 3.5%. It's no longer 4. My bad. So it used to be 4%. So now we're at 3.5 and 2. And so there we are. There's your dual mandate bullseye chart, 3.5 and 2. January 22, we were at 7 and roughly 4. Ooh, not good. Monetary policy, the GDP and the price level. There is a cause and effect change with the market for money. As people are looking for money, it causes some issues. Investment, you got that investment demand curve that we have looked at. And that investment demand curve and and asset demand is going to deal with, it's going to look at that whole, mess with that whole monetary policy and price level issue. Equilibrium GDP will also get into that. So we have to know, are we dealing with expansionary monetary policy, or are we looking at restrictive monetary policy? So monetary policy and equilibrium GDP, if we are down, if we have a downward sloping demand for money, we can have supply of money, which is going to be fixed in a vertical. There at 1, 2, or 3. At 1, we have interest rate of 10. At 2, it's at 8, and at 3, it's at 6. So probably best, and you see that investment demand at 10, 8, and 6. It's probably best at 8 on that. And then here we go, upward sloping aggregate supply, downward sloping aggregate demand. Once again, P2, P3. Probably once again looking at P2, which is probably again looking at 8% interest. And there on the right, 81 with investment of 15, 82 at 20, which would be that 8% interest, 84 at investment of 22.5, and 83 at 25, excuse me. So once again, probably best at 8% interest. So we're going to stop right here. We'll pick up with expansionary monetary policy in video 2 and wrap it on up after that. Thank y'all, and I will see you in video 2.